I'm Tom Veblen. I'm a professor in the geography department at CU Boulder, and I've been working in Colorado since 1981 on ecological disturbances that affect forests in Colorado. In particular, in recent years, we've been concerned with the effects of climate variation on wildfire and bark beetle outbreaks. Bark beetles are native to North America, and so this is a species that's been here for many thousands, if not millions of years. And there's been a bark beetle outbreak, in particular mountain pine beetle outbreak, affecting lodgepole forests, began in the mid to late 1990s, and that's created a great deal of concern for numerous reasons, which I'll get into in a second. It's important to point out that although the mountain pine beetle outbreak is unprecedented in recent memory, and probably unprecedented over the last 50 to 80 years, we know that we've had widespread outbreaks in the past as well. It's very difficult to quantify the extent of these past outbreaks, but we know that past outbreaks have occurred in association with warmer temperatures and drier conditions. And we know from the tree ring research that over the last several hundred years to 1,000 years of tree ring record in Colorado, we've had other time periods that were just as warm and just as dry as the 1998 drought and subsequent years that are believed to be very important in promoting the current bark beetle outbreaks. In addition to the mountain pine beetle that attacks lodgepole pine, we also have a current outbreak of somewhat lesser, quite a bit lesser extent, of spruce beetle that attacks Engelmann spruce. In the case of the spruce beetle, we actually do have tree ring reconstructions done by people in my lab over the last 20 years that tell us that back in the 19th century, mid-19th century, we had very extensive spruce beetle outbreaks, just as extensive, probably more extensive as the outbreaks of today. So we know that in the case of spruce beetle outbreak, the current outbreak clearly is precedented by former outbreaks, which also were associated with drier and warmer conditions. The third type of bark beetle that affects Colorado forests on a massive scale today would be the Ips beetle that's mainly active in the pinyon juniper area in the southwest. And there's been a massive outbreak of Ips beginning again in the mid to late 1990s, which is responsible for something referred to as a widespread forest dieback affecting the southwestern region. But I'm going to be focusing mostly on the mountain pine beetle and the spruce beetle, which affects forests in the northern part of Colorado. The old idea, which is still popular among some people, is that fire suppression is believed to have increased the susceptibility of our forests to bark beetle outbreaks. And there's logic to this argument. It's based on the idea that fire suppression has created forests that are unusually old because we haven't had fires in abundance to reinitiate or restart tree growth, create opportunities for new stand development. The idea that fire suppression has significantly altered forest age structures applies pretty well to low elevation forests, to a good part, not all necessarily, but to a good part of the ponderosa pine and Douglas fir zone. When we get up into the subalpine zone, we go to quite high elevation where we have pure stands of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. It's less likely that fire suppression has had a widespread regional sort of impact on stand ages. We come to slightly lower elevation in the lodgepole pine zone. There's more debate about the effect of fire suppression, but what we know for sure about fire history in relation to fire suppression is that we've had long time periods in past centuries, based on the kind of tree ring research done in my lab, where the intervals between fires were just as great as they were during the 20th century. So even if fire suppression has had some impact on age structure, and it has had some impact, we just don't know how significant it's been, we have not created unusually old stands in comparison to the long-term norm, to what we call the historical range of variability. We also know from the occurrence of bark beetle outbreaks in areas such as central Alaska, where there is basically no fire suppression. You don't have to have fire suppression to trigger these massive spruce beetle and mountain pine beetle outbreaks. I participated in a conference of about 27 or 28 researchers working on different aspects of bark beetle outbreaks and their effects about 3 years ago at Snowbird in Utah. And we just recently finished a report led by Barbara Bentz at Utah State University. And there's an overwhelming consensus among these researchers that it's not human activities, it's not fire suppression that are the primary drivers of the bark beetle outbreaks, but rather it's climate, and in particular it's warming climate in association with drought. Well, I would certainly agree with the strong consensus among the atmospheric scientists that there's overwhelming evidence that the warming is anthropogenic, that it is related to greenhouse gas accumulation. In the case of Colorado, regardless of the actual cause of the warming, it's very clear that in the subalpine zone, say above about 9,000 feet, where we have lodgepole pine and spruce and fir forests, there's been a very steep increase in temperatures. In the last 50 years, there's been about a 2 to 2.5 degrees centigrade increase in the maximum and minimum average monthly or seasonal temperatures for all seasons of the year. In the case of the bark beetle outbreaks, the fact that we have warmer minimum temperatures during the winter means that we have fewer larvae being killed by extremely cold temperatures. And it's believed that past outbreaks in different parts of the western U.S. have been terminated by unusually cold temperatures. Under the current climate trend that is very evident in the climate record here since the 1950s, it's very unlikely that we're going to have extremely cold temperatures that could terminate the outbreaks. The other important aspect of the warming is that under warmer temperatures, the bark beetle life cycle is accelerated, so that at elevations, high elevations where previously it would take 2 years for the bark beetle to complete its life cycle, under warmer conditions, they complete their life cycle in a single year, which greatly accelerates their ability to grow their populations rapidly. If you were walking through a forest that did not have a mountain pine beetle outbreak, let's say 15 or 20 years ago, you wouldn't notice little yellow globules of resin on the bark like you see today. So when you walk through a lodgepole pine forest over on the western slope, let's say near Granby or Grand Lake, and especially about 5 years ago when the outbreak was really getting underway, you'd see that the trees were dotted with these globules of resin. And this is where the tree is attempting to pitch out the insect. And trees that are very vigorous and that have been growing rapidly sometimes can successfully overcome the attack and pitch the insects out. The tree also has chemical defenses against the insect. You'll see during an outbreak, in contrast with the past, that many trees have both entrance holes, very small holes, where the beetle has entered the tree, and then in the same stand sometimes you'll see a later stage where woodpeckers have been going after the larvae, sometimes peeling off the bark of the trees, especially with Engelmann's spruce. You'll see the very scaly bark of the spruce accumulated at the base of the tree. So just walking through our forests, even before the trees die, a good observer anyway is going to notice there's a substantial difference in the way the trees appear in terms of these symptoms. And then rather quickly after attack, within a couple of years, the needles on the lodgepole pine turn red. The trees enter what's referred to as the red phase, and we hear a lot about the red phase because this is a time period when people believe there might be an elevated risk of fire, because the fire risk, in this case, well, I should use the term fire hazard. That refers to the actual fuel component of the probability of a fire occurring. The fire hazard is very largely determined by small fuels, what we call fine fuels, in this case needles. And so when the needles are dead and they're in the red phase, we would expect an elevated fire risk. And then following the red phase, of course, you see thousands of dead standing lodgepole pine. And you get a very, very similar pattern with Engelmann spruce following spruce beetle outbreak. One of the important differences in terms of the detection of spruce beetle as opposed to mountain pine beetle outbreak is that you don't have such a prominent red phase in the case of the spruce beetle. The needles basically turn gray immediately, and so from the air it's more difficult to detect the outbreak of spruce beetle in a spruce fir forest than in the case of mountain pine beetle. Then following those red phases and gray phases in the case of the spruce beetle outbreak, we obviously have a lot of dead standing trees in the forest. And most people would just casually observe that and ask, don't we have a substantial increase in fire risk when we have all those dead standing trees? And somewhat counterintuitively, the research on fire behavior in relation to what we call fuels models, just the whole configuration of fuels of different sizes in the forest, show that once the trees have lost their needles, even though we have a lot of dead standing trees in the forest, we don't necessarily have an increase in fire hazard. And this is because, as I mentioned, the fire hazard is mostly determined by fine fuels. The needles drop from the tree crowns, from the branches. We no longer have a continuous canopy of fine fuels, and so it's actually more difficult to get a crown fire to spread through these forests. And we know from our observations during the documentary time period, say the last 80 years or so, that the typical kind of fire that burns large areas in the lodgepole pine and spruce and fir forest is a crown fire that spreads through the crowns. Certainly for the northern part of the state, I would say that more than half of the lodgepole pine forest already has been affected by mountain pine beetle. The species is certainly going to survive. There have been some suggestions that all of the old or mature lodgepole pine trees would be killed by mountain pine beetle. That's a slight, I emphasize, it's a slight exaggeration. We do see that there are some large diameter, old lodgepole pine that have been attacked, but were not attacked successfully, and for reasons that are not entirely clear, and it may just be the genetic characteristics of those trees, which determine their chemical defenses, have allowed some large trees to survive. But this often is only 2 or 3 trees in an acre. Driving along the highway near Granby or Grand Lake, you can see large areas where the vast majority of the lodgepole pine have been killed. If you look really carefully, you'll find a few surviving trees, not many per acre, but there are some mature trees that have survived. More importantly, you do see some seedlings of lodgepole pine. In some places, it appears that the regeneration of lodgepole pine will repopulate the forest to a forest very similar in structures to what was killed. There may be some areas where regeneration fails. There may be some areas then where, following the mountain pine beetle outbreak, a lodgepole pine forest might convert to a different kind of vegetation type. But that's not necessarily a bad, undesirable consequence. So overall, I don't think we need to be too concerned about the lodgepole pine ecosystem response to the mountain pine beetle. This species is well adapted to bark beetle outbreaks. It's well adapted to large-scale disturbances, and it's going to be with us in the future. Over the next 10 years or so, there's going to be a huge aesthetic impact on the landscape. With grad students and postdocs working in my lab, we've conducted studies that test the hypothesis that there should be an increase in the frequency, that just means the number of fires over a long period of time, or the extent of fire, or the severity of fire in relation to bark beetle outbreaks. And we've used tree ring methods and then direct observation of the fire behavior and data from satellite imagery on fire behavior to examine whether or not any of those different aspects of fire behavior increased after a very widespread outbreak of spruce beetle that affected most of the spruce fir forests of northwestern Colorado in the 1940s. And we found that in the subsequent 50 years, there was no increase in fire occurrence in the dead forests. Then we did a similar study examining the effects of the current mountain pine beetle outbreak that began in the late 1990s because we had a major fire year in 2002. And for many people, they knew that since some forests had been killed by mountain pine beetle and spruce beetle in the late 1990s, and then we had a fire in 2002, for many people they just immediately concluded, the fires must be due to beetle outbreak. But when we compared areas that burned in 2002 in beetle-killed forests and in areas that were not killed by beetles, we found no significant difference in the fire behavior. In other words, the fact that we had abundant, recently killed trees in the year 2002 did not have a major influence on, or a detectable influence on fire behavior. Now, these are case studies in the sense that the interpretation and the implications of these studies are limited to the conditions of the year 2002 and, for example, the fire weather at that time. But these studies lead us to conclude that the knee-jerk automatic response that because we have some dead standing trees in the forest, we should have a dramatically increase in fire hazard is not, or in fire risk, is not necessarily true. When we use the term fire hazard, we're referring to the type of fuel in the forest, the size of the fuel, how much of the fuel there is, whether we have what are called fuel ladders, which would be small trees, saplings in the understory that could carry a fire up into the crown and so on. That's just one component of assessing the broader probability of fire, which is fire risk. Fire risk is greatly determined by short-term weather conditions as well as average weather conditions or seasonal and annual climate conditions. Tree ring research that we've done for many years in Colorado show that in the subalpine forests of lodgepole, spruce, and fir, that years of widespread fire only occur during exceptional droughts that are similar to the year 2002, and that we often, in very large areas, huge catchments or watersheds covering 10 or 12,000 acres, we often go 100 years with no large fires occurring at all, simply because we didn't have the exceptionally dry conditions that are suitable for fire occurrence. So, in trying to summarize sort of the practical consequences of our research, I could say that prior to the bark beetle outbreaks of the late 1990s, we had a history of infrequent fires occurring in the subalpine zone that were highly dependent on exceptional drought. We now know that we've had a substantial warming trend at high elevations in Colorado. We expect to continue to have the kind of natural variability in our climate system that produces precipitation variation, so we don't expect drought to go away, but our future droughts are going to occur under warmer conditions. And so this continued natural variability that produces drought in combination with warming conditions is going to increase the likelihood that we have those infrequently really dry, warm conditions that we know historically have been associated with years of very widespread fire. And the overall contribution of the bark beetle outbreaks to the fire risk appears to be minor. We're going to get widespread fires if weather conditions are conducive to widespread fires, regardless of whether we have living or dead trees. I like to emphasize that we don't have a wildfire problem, we have a people problem in terms of where we want to spend a lot of resources to try and mitigate against the hazard and risk of fire. In wild areas, fairly remote areas, we have the options of using policies such as the so-called fire use policy in the sense that many areas are planned for letting fires burn, and that actually reduces the hazard of subsequent more extensive and more severe fires. And so in those remote areas, it's unlikely that our society is going to want to spend a lot of money thinning forests to try and reduce fire hazard and fire risk there, because it would cost a tremendous amount of money, and we have cheaper, more effective ways of doing that anyway. So the real debate today is how to spend our resources effectively in a strategic sense. And there's a very strong consensus that we should be spending our resources on fire mitigation, meaning mostly thinning operations to reduce fuels in what's known as the wildland-urban interface. And these are areas where people have settled over the last especially 20, 25 years. We have excellent examples of the recent growth of the wildland-urban interface into the subalpine zone. The wildland-urban interface is often viewed as being just in the ponderosa pine and Douglas fir zone at low elevation in the Front Range, for example. But if you drive up around Winter Park, on the outskirts of Fraser, you see that there are many homes that have been built in recent years almost underneath the canopy of a lodgepole pine forest. These are forests that we know from tree ring studies originated after a very small number of fires that occurred in the 19th century. In just a few years, like the year 1851 was a year of very widespread fire, and now people are living in those areas. And some people have argued that that is actually an area of low fire risk because fires occur infrequently. Well, in that sense, yes, you have a low probability each year of a fire occurring, but when it does occur, and if it behaves like fires have occurred in the past, you have an extremely high fire risk of the fire becoming widespread and severe. And so that's a wildland-urban interface problem, which is becoming more severe, and that's where a lot of resources today are being spent to try and thin trees around the homes that have been established in the lodgepole pine zone. I support the work done by our fire hazard mitigation community in terms of reducing hazards right around homes. I mean, it's just a logical thing to do. You've got homes there now. We want to reduce the risk to people and property. But my recommendation in the long term is one that's rarely popular, and that is we need to have some serious long-term planning, zoning, that reduces ex-urban development, that reduces the continued growth of residential areas into these former wildland areas. That's what's creating the problem. But that's an extremely complex and politically sensitive issue. There certainly are county commissioners who tend to support that sort of viewpoint, but their ideas are met with a lot of resistance. There are people who are concerned about the so-called takings issue, when ranchers that may own property in the subalpine zone want to sell some forest area for developers, and if it gets rezoned, of course, that has a financial impact on them. But in my view, in the long term, the only rational solution to this problem is to have people live out of harm's way. It's very analogous to people living in floodplains. We know we're going to have floods in the future, and we can only go so far in terms of preventing those floods. And the same applies to the extensive and severe fires that are characteristic of subalpine forests and that are required to regenerate subalpine forests. Climate change is the most difficult problem that our civilization faces. One of the reasons that it is the most difficult problem is that it's going to require a sustained long-term response, and we need to be responding to this challenge as soon as possible. We have delayed responding effectively in this country for decades. Certainly for the last 20 years, we have had strong evidence that climate change induced by human activities is a major challenge that needs to be addressed. At this stage, I strongly agree with the climate scientists who recommend a whole variety of so-called climate actions that will reduce our carbon emissions and to move us towards renewable energy sources. And I strongly agree with the social scientists and the policymakers who emphasize that our immediate response has to be adaptation. We need to resolve what are we going to do about water resources in the near future under warmer, drier conditions. Given the fact that natural variability in precipitation is going to continue, in combination with a warming trend that we believe is due to human activities, it's likely that we're going to have unprecedented fire risk in the subalpine zone of Colorado for sure, and probably in the montane zone. And when I say unprecedented, I certainly refer to unprecedented in recent memory, the last 20 years, undoubtedly. If we go back to the 19th century, in the 1850s to 1880s, we did have similar episodes of drought and widespread fire, but there's been nothing comparable to the risk that we are beginning to see now during the 20th century. Based on tree ring studies of fire history and tree ring reconstructions of temperatures that we know from, let me start again, okay. Based on tree ring reconstructions of fire history across the western United States, in combination with tree ring records that are sensitive to temperature variation in the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, we know that at time scales of around 30 to 80 years, we've had past periods of drier conditions affecting most of North America, certainly almost all the western United States, in conjunction with warmer temperatures at what we call multi-decadal timescales, 30 to 80 year time periods for the North Atlantic. When those warm North Atlantic conditions coincide with cooler temperatures in the Pacific, we tend to get years of drier conditions that are associated with synchronized fire occurrence throughout the Rocky Mountain region, and at a 30 to 80 year time scale, even synchronized all across Western North America. I don't mean that in a single year half the continent burns, but I mean that there is elevated fire occurrence across Western North America during time periods that last 30 to 80 years. And this is now well documented based on tree ring records going back 500 years. So that kind of natural variability, which is not due to human impacts on the atmosphere, is going to continue in the future. And we do know that in the late 1990s, the North Atlantic began a new warming phase. We can't predict for sure if that's going to last 30 or 80 years, but based on the past record, it seems likely it's going to last for decades. And so even in the absence of warming, we expect there's going to be increased drought that's related to the atmospheric circulation patterns that in complex ways that are not well understood are influenced by the warming temperatures of the Atlantic. In terms of adapting to trends that are already underway, I think we have to be honest and tell the public that we're going to have increased risk of wildfire in subalpine forests and in montane forests in Colorado. We're not going to be able to change the climatic factors that influence that risk. So at best, in dealing with that risk, we can reduce the threat of fuel accumulation right around homes. We can develop land use policies, zoning policies that put fewer residences at risk. But I think in terms of public education, we need to tell the public that warming is going to continue, even though we need to start climate actions and reduce carbon emissions as soon as possible to prevent more severe warming. But certainly in the next 10, 20, or 30 years, it's likely that we're going to see increased fire risk, and we need to adapt to that risk. It's analogous to the bark beetle outbreaks. We cannot prevent the bark beetle outbreaks. We have to adapt to the occurrence of the bark beetle outbreaks and develop policies that don't waste a lot of money trying to prevent something that can probably not be prevented. There have been several studies in the western United States showing that snowpacks have declined in recent decades in relation to warming, and this is not a big surprise. With warming temperatures, you would expect more of the precipitation to fall as rain rather than as snow. There have also been studies showing then that snow melt is generally earlier in the spring than in the past. In association with these studies of changes in snow melt, we also have seen that there's been an increase in the length of fire seasons. In other words, the time in the spring when land management agencies have to send crews out to start fighting large blazes has moved up in time. It's earlier in the year, and the end of the fire season when they can wrap things up also is extending further into the fall. And there's strong evidence to suggest that changes in the accumulation persistence of snow is very important in increasing the fire season, all of which of course are related to warming. There was a very comprehensive paper published in Science in the year 2006 by Tony Westerling and his colleagues, who analyzed the available data from the early 1970s to the present, and they showed something like a 25 or 30-day increase in the total length of the fire season. So that's a substantial increase. Occasionally, people make some rather optimistic predictions based on assumptions that are questionable, and one of those optimistic predictions is that, well, a benefit of the bark beetle outbreak might mean an increase in water yields, and of course that's a major issue in Colorado. As a society, we have to deal with water scarcity. And at the level of an individual stand, you can actually show an increase in water yield following logging, but there's a scale limitation to that, so that when you cut over very, very large areas and you reduce the capture of snow by tree canopies, and you end up creating less persistence of snow, earlier snow melt, you're likely to have just the opposite effect if you deforest very large areas. And so it's a question of, yes, from a forest management perspective, there's research that indicates that water yield can be increased at a certain relatively local scale through cutting procedures, but at a very broad scale covering the whole subalpine zone, we have to consider the protective influence of the forest on the watershed. Warming is creating some challenges from the perspective of how we adapt to increase wildfire risk. We tend to automatically think of forest thinning to reduce fuels as pretty much our only option. And we have a large number of people whose profession is in that field, whose income depends on that. And it's not surprising that when we go to these experts, that the first thing that they tell us is that yes, we can do some fuels mitigation through thinning. And that's justified in particular cases around homes and around other high value assets such as reservoirs and so on. But we need to be thinking much more broadly about possible adaptations to this increased risk. And the key issue that has not received sufficient attention and debate is changes in land use policy. Should we have larger or any buffers in terms of residential development around wildland areas? Should old mining inholdings that are included in national forests be allowed to be used for residential development? You know, and much of this the residential development has already happened in many places, but there are still many areas today where developers are buying land adjacent to subalpine forests to construct residences on, and especially at the level of counties, county commissioners, there is the opportunity to change that pattern. It requires a lot of debate and a lot of political activism to resist the obvious interests that will benefit from that kind of development. But as a society, most of us don't want to have our tax money used to reduce fuels in places where people have made unwise locational decisions.